The surgical drape smelled like industrial bleach and something else, something that lived in her muscles, not her nose. Hannah Clarke folded them anyway, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd once folded field bandages under incoming fire. The creases were perfect. They were always perfect. 8 months at St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh, and not a single thread out of place, not a single moment of visibility. The fluorescent lights hummed above the supply room like they were keeping time with her heartbeat, steady and measured, the way she'd learned to keep it when steady meant staying alive. Her left leg ached as she shifted her weight, the old fracture from Bagram speaking its slow language of pain. Pain is information. Pain is data. She'd learned that from the best. The limp was barely noticeable if you weren't watching for it, and nobody watched. Nobody saw the muscular tension in her shoulders that came from years of carrying weight that wasn't hers to carry. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked every exit in every room, a habit that had saved lives in the Cunha province and made her look paranoid in a hospital supply closet. She moved like someone who'd learned to disappear, and at St. Michael's, disappearing was easy. Disappearing was survival. The scrubs she wore were the same pale blue as everyone else's, unremarkable, forgettable. She preferred it that way. Inside her jacket lining, stitched between the polyester and the batting, was a faded unit patch from her old life. She touched it sometimes when the fluorescent lights started feeling like searchlights. The patch had survived 3 deployments. It had survived medevac helicopters and sand that got into everything. It had survived the moment her captain, the person she used to be, had made the call to carry a wounded Marine to the extraction point under fire, carrying him like he weighed nothing, carrying him like her body was made for the weight. That patch had survived. Everything else had been left behind. The ER was unusually quiet for a Tuesday evening in September. Quiet was good. Quiet meant nobody was dying. Quiet meant she could fold drapes and pretend the antiseptic smell didn't trigger the sound of rotor blades. She'd been folding surgical supplies for 8 months, every shift the same small geography of the supply room, the linen closet, the back corridors where nobody saw her move. It wasn't the life she'd trained for, but it was the life she'd been assigned. Military intelligence had placed her at St. Michael's for reasons she couldn't discuss, to watch for reasons she'd been told were critical. A suspected diversion ring, pharmaceuticals disappearing from inventory, hydrocodone and fentanyl moving through the hospital supply chain like blood through veins. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to watch. She was supposed to report. She was very good at being invisible. The intercom crackled at 7:14 p.m. Trauma alert, ETA 6 minutes. Disabled veteran, vehicle accident, respiratory compromise. The words fell into the fluorescent hum and changed everything, though Hannah didn't know it yet. She set down the drape she'd been folding, the motion deliberate and slow. Her training made her careful. Her training made her move without urgency. It made her human, a nurse who happened to be working supply room that evening, nothing more. The ER corridor was already in motion by the time she stepped out. She'd learned to watch people the way other nurses learned to read cardiac monitors. Dr. Pierce was there, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum like the ticking of a clock counting down. His residents orbited him like planets caught in his gravity, 3 of them, their faces showing the particular exhaustion of people who'd been absorbing his criticisms all day. Pierce was the kind of doctor who'd learned early that arrogance could be mistaken for authority if you moved fast enough and spoke loud enough. His voice was the sound of someone who'd never had to prove anything because he'd never met anyone who could make him prove it. "What's the ETA?" Pierce asked, not looking at anyone in particular, asking the air itself as if it owed him an answer. The trauma nurse, Williams, for years at St. Michael's, solid clinician, checked the radio. 5 minutes. Maybe 4. Hannah moved past them to the medication supply station, reaching for the crash cart. She didn't move quickly. She never moved quickly. But her hands knew what they were doing. 12 lead EKG pads, for start kits, epinephrine, atropine, muscle memory from a lifetime ago when she'd been Captain Hannah Clarke instead of Hannah Clarke, night shift supply room, invisible. Her fingers found everything without her brain having to direct them. The ambulance doors burst open and the patient came through like a storm, the paramedics calling out vitals with the clipped precision of people who'd seen too much. 52-year-old male, vehicle versus cyclist, significant chest trauma, breath sounds absent on the right, O2 sat dropping, 88 and falling, the veteran's chest was visibly moving on only one side, his cyanotic lips already the color of someone drowning in his own blood. His eyes were wide and vacant with pain, the look of someone whose body had betrayed him and was now finishing the job. Dr. Pierce looked up from his computer. He looked at the stretcher, at the collapsed lung working its way through the man's thorax, at the skin turning shades of blue that meant minutes, maybe fewer. He looked at the patient's medical history, someone the hospital had seen before, someone labeled in the system, and something moved across his face. Not concern. Not urgency. Recognition. The kind of recognition a predator has for prey that's already wounded. Chart. Pierce asked, holding out his hand without moving toward the patient. A resident handed it to him. Pierce scanned it, his jaw tightening, his expression settling into something that looked like decision. He was deciding something. Hannah watched it happen the way she'd learned to watch things, cataloging every micro-movement, every unconscious tell. She'd been trained by the best snipers in the army to read people at distance. Pierce was easy to read. Pierce was arrogant. His history is problematic, Pierce said, loud enough for the ER to hear. Not loud enough that the patient would question it, but loud enough that the residents would absorb it, would carry it, would pass it along to the rest of the staff like a virus in the bloodstream. We've seen this pattern before. Medication-seeking behavior, non-compliance with treatment protocols, hospital shopping for narcotics. William's face flickered. The residents exchanged glances. The patient's oxygen was dropping. 88 to 85 to 82. His lung is collapsing, Williams said, her voice careful, professional. He needs. Pierce raised a hand. Not a gesture. A dismissal. We'll observe. Let's get another set of vitals in 10 minutes. Someone pull his full prior records. I want to see what we're really dealing with here. He turned away and walked back to his residence, his expensive shoes moving with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The veteran's eye stayed on the ceiling, vacant and drowning. Hannah Clarke stood holding the crash cart, her face showing nothing at all, and made a choice that would rewrite everything that came after. But that wasn't the worst part. The veteran lay in the ER bay for another 7 minutes while his oxygen dropped to 79, then 76, then 72. The nurses, Williams and Rodriguez and the per diem girl whose name Hannah couldn't remember, kept looking at Pierce. Kept waiting. The old rule of hospitals, doctors decide. Even when the nurses are watching a man die of a tension pneumothorax, watching his lung collapse like a building imploding, the decision belongs to the doctor. The resident, a young man named Chen, maybe 6 months into his rotation, had looked at Williams twice, his face saying what his mouth couldn't say in front of Pierce. They could intubate. They could needle decompress. They could do a dozen things that would save this man's life. But Pierce had decided something else, and in hospitals, the doctor's decision is law. Hannah set down the crash cart and walked toward the break room, moving without hurry, moving like someone whose shift was fine and whose world wasn't about to change. She passed through the ER again as Pierce was fielding a question from one of his residents about admission protocols. 12 other doctors would see this man's chart before the night was over. 12 would read Pierce's assessment and make the same calculation: this patient is difficult, this patient is marked, this patient is not worth the risk. Hannah counted them later, each one who came and looked and turned away. She counted each refusal like prayer beads, each dismissal like a clock ticking toward a moment she couldn't see yet but could feel coming. The veteran's eyes had stopped being frightened by the time his oxygen hit 68. The veteran's oxygen sat at 68% when Dr. Pierce finished his phone calls. Hannah watched from the nurse's station as he worked methodically through the attending roster, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. She counted each conversation. Each refusal. Each poisoned well. One doctor hung up after 40 seconds. Non-compliant, you said? Yeah, I'm booked solid. 2. A resident asked a single question before Pierce's tone shifted, ice water in his lungs. His history speaks for itself. 3. 4. 5. The calls blurred into a symphony of rejection, each physician nodding along to Pierce's script before moving to the next case, the next surgery, the next patient worth their time. By the 12th refusal, Hannah had stopped counting on her fingers and started counting in her chest instead, a ticking that felt less like a clock and more like a timer running toward something she couldn't see but could feel coming like humidity before a storm. The veteran sat in the waiting area at 4:15 a.m., his wheelchair angled toward the television playing a rerun of a cooking show nobody watched. His lips had begun to turn that particular shade of blue-gray that meant his blood wasn't carrying oxygen anymore, just the memory of it. A medical aide wheeled past without stopping. The transport techs had moved on to other patients. The ER had 12 reasons not to care about him, and each reason wore a white coat. Hannah logged off her station at 6:13 a.m. Her shift was technically over at 7, but she lingered, watching Pierce in the hallway, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a scarf he'd bought at a department store. He moved through corridors the way certain men moved through the world, convinced that his presence elevated whatever space he occupied, that his opinions were law, that refusal was just another word for authority. She didn't flinch when she saw her patient's chart projected on the grand round screen at 7:02 a.m. The amphitheater held maybe 30 people, residents, interns, attending physicians, students. Pierce clicked to her nursing notes from intake, enlarging them so the text filled the entire wall behind him like an indictment. Notice here how Nurse Clarke, or should I say Nurse Florence Nightingale, advocated for 45 minutes of physician time on a patient with documented behavioral issues. His smile was the smile of a man who understood that humiliation was just another tool, and tools were made to be wielded. This is misplaced nurse advocacy that wastes resources and demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of clinical priorities. This is what happens when the support staff overestimates their qualifications. This is why we have hierarchy. 20 faces turned toward her. She stood in the back, arms crossed, and felt each pair of eyes the way you feel a hand pressing on an old wound. She didn't look away. She didn't look down. She met Pierce's gaze and watched something flicker across his face, not concern, but recognition that she wasn't performing the reaction he'd rehearsed. He'd expected flushing cheeks. He'd expected a trembling jaw. He'd expected her to disappear into herself the way most people did when exposed like this. Instead, she took one measured breath, and it sounded like the intake of breath before a soldier picks up a rifle. The break room at 11:51 a.m. smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a microwave that hadn't been cleaned since 2019. Hannah stood at the vending machine, feeding a dollar bill into the slot, when she heard the voices behind her, not trying to be quiet, just naturally loud the way certain people were loud everywhere, as if volume was evidence of importance. "Hey, Clarke, did you get your medical degree from a cereal box?" The taller resident didn't turn to look at her, just spoke to his friend as if she was furniture. "Maybe we should start calling you Dr. Crunch." The other laughed. Actually laughed. No, she's clearly more qualified than Pierce. 8 months of experience versus his 15 years. Math checks out. They were playing a game now, performing for the 3 other people in the break room, people who looked away because looking away was safer. Hannah turned slowly. The taller resident met her eyes and smiled, a smile that said he'd done this before, that there were no consequences, that the world had taught him that cruelty was just honesty wearing a confident voice. She took one measured breath. Felt her heartbeat steady itself like a hand finding purchase on a ledge. And then a single tear escaped, just one, precise, deliberate, which she wiped away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. The smile on the resident's face faltered because tears meant he'd won, except he hadn't, because her eyes stayed locked on his the entire time, and her voice, when it came, sounded like the firing pin of a gun being drawn back. "Document this conversation." Her voice was flat. Utterly flat. "You'll want the timestamp when the investigation begins." The break room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric drone above the cabinets. The two residents exchanged a look that said they'd miscalculated something fundamental. Hannah bought her jello, turned back toward the door, and walked past them the way soldiers walked through rooms, not fast, not slow, just with the absolute certainty that the space ahead would arrange itself to accommodate her passage. The investigation wouldn't happen. Not yet. But they didn't know that. At 1:22 p.m., Hannah walked to Pierce's office. His door was open. She knocked anyway, a courtesy he'd never extended to anyone else. He looked up from his computer, and something flickered across his face, not concern, just annoyance at being interrupted by someone he'd already moved past mentally. "I'm filing a formal complaint," Hannah said, "regarding treatment of a patient in critical condition and the harassment I experienced this morning in grand rounds." Pierce's expression shifted. Not to anger. Something worse. Something like amusement. "Come in. Close the door." He waited until she complied, then leaned back in his chair. "You know what your problem is? You don't understand the hierarchy of a hospital. You're a nurse. A good one, maybe. But you're not a physician. You're not in a position to advocate for anything. You're in a position to follow protocol and remember your place." Hannah didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes the most devastating reply available. Pierce made a phone call while she stood there. "Security? This is Dr. Pierce in the main office. I have a staff member here who's showing signs of emotional distress. Can you send someone to escort her to HR for evaluation? I'm concerned about her stability." He hung up without waiting for a response. "HR will want to talk to you about appropriate workplace conduct." She felt the security guard's hand on her elbow 30 seconds later, gentle, professional, utterly final. He was just doing his job. They always were. Pierce smiled as they walked toward the door. That same smile. The one that said he'd handled this situation perfectly, that she was a problem he'd solved with a phone call, that by this time tomorrow she would be reassigned or fired and he would return to his rounds, his surgeries, his 12 refusals. Hannah paused in the doorway. Look back at him. And when she spoke, her voice was so quiet that only he could hear it, a voice like cold steel being drawn from a sheath. "You'll regret teaching me I have nothing left to lose." Pierce's smile faltered. Not much. Just enough that she saw the moment when he realized he'd made a miscalculation, when he understood that whatever he'd just triggered was not something his phone calls or his title or his carefully cultivated network could undo. But then his expression hardened again, and he turned back to his computer, dismissing her the way you dismiss a thought that doesn't matter. The security guard led her down the hallway. Behind them, from inside the office, the phone began to ring. The charge nurse looked up from her computer as Hannah approached the ER desk, her jaw already set with the particular exhaustion that came from a shift spent watching a man die slowly while everyone around her pretended not to notice. 3:30. 30 minutes since Pierce had cleared the waiting area, his voice carrying that special weight of authority that made people stop asking questions. "Where is he?" Hannah's voice was level. Professional. A nurse asking about a patient's location, nothing more. "Who?" The charge nurse didn't even glance away from her screen. "Bed 7. The veteran." A shrug. The kind of gesture that carried the weight of 12 refusals, 12 moments when someone in a white coat had turned away. Pierce had him transferred. Said he was getting hostile. Probably left with security by now. The charge nurse added, almost as an afterthought, he was medication seeking anyway. Not our problem anymore. Hannah didn't respond. She never did, not to these moments. She simply turned and walked toward the waiting area, her shoes making no sound on the linoleum, moving with a kind of purposeful silence that belonged to someone who had learned long ago that it was the quiet people who got things done. The waiting room was empty. For orange chairs, a television playing a commercial about heartburn medication, and the faint smell of antiseptic mixing with something else, the sharp metallic tang of fear sweat, the kind that happened when a body was shutting down. She could still smell it in the air. Recent. Minutes, not ours. Hannah retraced the veteran's path through her mind the way she'd traced 1,000 other paths through Bagram, through Kandahar, through the kind of places where you learn to read a room the way some people read books. A confused man. Disoriented. In pain. Where would he go if security was coming, if the only people he'd trusted had just turned their backs? Not toward the exit. That was the mistake everyone made. They thought scared people ran. Scared people hid. She moved down the east corridor, past the X-ray department where the technician was laughing at something on her phone, past the patient bathrooms with their locks that clicked too loudly. The hallway opened into a secondary wing, supply storage, equipment rooms, the kinds of spaces that existed in every hospital like forgotten spaces in a house no one lived in anymore. The air here was cooler. Quieter. The fluorescent lights had that particular quality of hospitals at mid-afternoon, the dead time between lunch and the evening shift chaos. The supply closet was 3 doors down, partially ajar. Hannah pushed it open without knocking. The veteran was on the floor between 2 shelves of dressing supplies and 4 bags, his back against the cold metal shelving unit, and his breathing had the particular quality of a man whose lungs were drowning him. His lips had already turned that specific shade of blue that meant minutes, not hours. His chest was moving in the wrong way, one side expanding while the other stayed locked, rigid, fighting gravity. His eyes were unfocused, swimming in the pale distance between consciousness and shock. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. The pressure inside his chest building with every desperate breath, crushing the heart, collapsing the vessels, a slow suffocation from the inside out. The same thing that happened when shrapnel punctured the pleural space and no one was there to decompress it. The same thing she'd seen in a field hospital north of Bagram in 2019, in a soldier named Marcus who hadn't made it because the nearest surgical team was 40 minutes away. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up with her hands. Gloves from the supply shelf. Alcohol swab. The 14-gauge catheter from the emergency kit that lived in every supply closet because someone, somewhere, had learned the hard way that you needed these things close. Her hands weren't shaking. Hands didn't shake when they belonged to someone who had trained muscle memory like other people trained dogs. His respiratory rate was 48. Oxygen saturation at 71% on the portable monitor she pulled from the shelf. The jugular veins in his neck were distended like ropes, bulging with the pressure that had nowhere to go. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomy as clear in her mind as it had been in field hospitals, in transport helicopters, in the moment before everything changed. Her fingers found the spot, just above the rib, avoiding the artery, avoiding the nerve, threading the needle through the anatomical spaces she could see with her eyes closed. The catheter went through skin, through muscle, through the pleural membrane. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of pressure equalizing, of a lung suddenly able to expand, of a body remembering how to breathe. The veteran's color began to shift, that progression from gray to blue to something approaching pink, the kind of transformation that happened when oxygen returned to tissues that were forgetting how to live. She secured the catheter with a piece of tape and placed her hand on his shoulder, grounding him, letting him know that he wasn't alone in this closet, that someone was here, that the drowning was stopping. "Easy," she said. Her voice was quiet. Not the voice of a nurse. The voice of someone who had said this exact word in 100 moments of crisis, in a language underneath language, the one that all humans understood when death was close enough to touch. His eyes began to focus. Not all the way, the medications and shock still had him, his pupils still dilated, his awareness still swimming, but something was happening. Something was changing in the moment between one breath and the next. And then she saw it. The tattoo on his forearm, just visible above the edge of his sleeve. Black ink, old enough to be faded, the kind of permanent marking that was never chosen lightly. H. and Clarke. Bagram. 2019. Her call sign. Her first name. Her location. Her year. The year she'd carried someone to a medevac helicopter under fire, her hands and body and entire existence wrapped around a soldier who was bleeding out faster than his body could replace the blood. The year she'd watched the bird lift off and disappear into a desert sky and wondered if that was the last time she'd ever save someone's life. The year before she'd vanished. The room was moving in a way that rooms didn't move. The supply closet walls seemed to expand and contract with her breathing. She reached up and touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the same insignia, the same team, the same call sign that was now tattooed on the arm of the man who was supposed to be dead or gone or somewhere else, anywhere else, not here, not now, not when she'd spent 18 months pretending to be someone she wasn't. But that wasn't the worst part. The supply closet door opened behind her. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway with his phone already raised, already recording, his face moving through an expression that began as shock and was rapidly becoming something darker, the look of a man who had just realized that the thing he'd been trying to destroy had already destroyed him, if he'd only had the eyes to see it. 3 seconds. That's all Hannah needed. She didn't hesitate. Didn't calculate odds or weigh consequences. The supply closet door hung half open, fluorescent light spilling across linoleum, and inside that rectangle of brightness she saw what the entire emergency department had failed to see, a human being drowning in his own chest cavity while a room full of physicians looked away. 3 seconds and her hand moved. Muscle memory. The kind that lives in bone and nerve fiber, in 17 years of muscle memory that didn't care about cover identities or nursing licenses or the mission she'd been running for 8 months. Her fingers found the 14-gauge catheter on the supply cart. Sterile. Ready. The plastic casing cool against her palm. She stepped into the supply closet and closed the door softly behind her. The veteran lay slumped against cardboard boxes labeled Foley catheters and for start kits, his breathing a wet, panic gasping that meant his lung had partially collapsed and was pushing on his heart. Tension pneumothorax. The O2 sat monitor on the wall outside was screaming at 67%. His skin was the color of a bruise, purple-gray, mottled, the color of a body running out of time. "Hey," Hannah said quietly. "Look at me." His eyes found hers. No recognition. Just pain and terror and the crystalline clarity of a man understanding, on some deep animal level, that his body was failing him. She positioned him on his left side. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in Kandahar dust storms and forward operating base surgical tents. Her hands moved like a surgeon's hands, which they were, just not the kind that got mentioned in hospital credentials. She found the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark where a needle could let the trapped air escape and let his lungs inflate again. "This is going to help," she said. "Not going to hurt. Just pressure." She didn't wait for acknowledgement. The catheter needle slid between his ribs with the particular resistance of metal through tissue, through pleura, through the desperate physics of a body suffocating from the inside. There. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The textbook answer to a question his body had been screaming. The hiss. That signature exhalation of pressurized air escaping, the sound of a lung remembering how to breathe, of tension releasing, of a body getting a second chance it didn't know it was being offered. She left the plastic catheter in place, pulled the needle out, and watched the O2 sat monitor climb. 71, 75. 79, stable. His breathing eased from that wet panic gasping into something almost rhythmic. Color returned to his face. The mottled gray faded toward something approaching human. She was running water over her hands, crimson spiraling down the drain, blood carrying with it the last fragments of her cover when the supply closet door swung open. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway. His phone was already raised. Already recording. His face moved through an expression that began as shock and was rapidly becoming something darker. "What are you doing?" His voice climbed. "What are you, security? I need security in the supply closet. Now." Hannah didn't turn around. She finished washing her hands. The water ran clear. She dried them on a paper towel and turned to face him, and something in her expression must have registered because his hand tightened on the phone. "You just committed assault," he said. His voice had that particular quality of someone who'd already started planning the destruction. On hospital property. Without physician authorization. On camera. The veteran was breathing normally now. His color was improving. His eyes had closed, either from relief or medication or the simple exhaustion of being alive after staring down his own death. He was dying, Hannah said. That's not your decision to make. Pierce was already dialing. Security arrived in 40 seconds, two of them, looking confused about what they were arresting a nurse for. Pierce's voice followed them out the door, already moving to his next call, the medical board. Then the State Licensing Bureau. Then two investigators whose names Hannah heard repeated twice each, investigators he'd worked with before, investigators he was now calling in favors from. She heard fragments as they walked her toward administration, rogue nurse, unauthorized invasive procedure, psychiatric episode, yes, I need an emergency review, tonight. By 5:02 p.m. she sat across from the HR director while Pierce's voice continued echoing through speakerphone calls, each one another layer of institutional pressure. The HR director kept asking the same questions. Did you consider waiting for authorization? Do you understand the hospital liability? Are you aware of the legal exposure? What none of them understood, what no one in that administrative corridor could possibly have known, was that Hannah's nursing position wasn't employment. It was assignment. Military intelligence. Human operation running under OPSEC protocols so tight that even the hospital's own security clearance couldn't access them. 8 months she'd been here. 8 months tracking a controlled substance diversion ring that had moved 47,000 milliliters of fentanyl and 23,000 pills of morphine through St. Michael's surgical suites. Blowing her cover meant mission failure. It meant months of investigation scattered. It meant a trafficking network dissolving before the net closed. It meant the operation was over. At 8:51 p.m., the HR director slid termination papers across the desk. Effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker, then out of the building. Your access badge is being deactivated as of 9:08 p.m. Hannah signed the papers. Her hand was steady. It always was. At 11:31 p.m., she returned through the loading dock entrance. Her badge still worked for another 29 minutes. The loading dock smelled like diesel fuel and something else, the particular antiseptic tang of institutional cleaning chemicals mixing with the faint copper scent of medical waste in the bins. The laundry room was empty. Rows of industrial washers hummed their mindless rhythm. Fluorescent lights cast everything in the particular gray of 11:16 at night in a basement. She found her locker, the one she'd used for 8 months, the one with her name written in faded tape on a piece of paper taped to the door. Her scrubs were folded in the basket inside. 3 pairs. 3 sets of the identity she'd constructed. She removed them slowly and laid them on the metal bench. She began folding them one final time. First pair, she pulled it taut, aligned the arms, creased the neckline, folded the body in half, then quarters, then eighths. Precision. The kind of precision that had kept people alive. Each crease perfect. Each fold aligned with mathematical accuracy. This pair went on the left side of the bench. Second pair, same process. The muscle memory of someone who'd packed field kits for evacuation helicopters, who'd organized medical supplies under fire, who understood that order in small things reflected order in large things. This one went in the middle. Third pair, as she folded this one, she allowed herself one moment, not of weakness, but of accounting. 8 months of night shifts. 237 patients treated. 12 doctors she'd watched refuse to treat one of them. One veteran who'd carried her name in a tattoo across the Bagram Desert because she'd been the last person willing to save him. One mission that had failed because she couldn't let a soldier die when she was the only person in the room who could stop it. Each crease was a small funeral for the identity she'd built. Each fold a goodbye to the mission she'd failed. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining. She could feel it there, worn fabric, frayed edges, the insignia of a unit that no longer officially existed. Bagram. 2019, the tattoo the veteran wore on his forearm. The same call sign. The same woman. She picked up her jacket and left the 3 pairs of scrubs stacked on the bench, folded with the precision of someone saying goodbye. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she didn't yet know what was walking through the hospital's front doors at 6:53 the next morning, what was about to arrive with credentials that would make security directors go pale, what was about to read her service record aloud in a hallway full of witnesses while Dr. Pierce's entire network of institutional destruction came crashing down around him. The worst part was that she walked out of St. Michael's Hospital that night believing she'd failed everyone, the veteran, the mission, herself, not knowing that the moment Pierce had activated his network of destruction, he'd also activated something else, a classified security clearance flag that had been triggered by the background check he demanded, a flag that had been waiting in the system for 8 months, a flag that was now reaching people who understood exactly who Captain Hannah Clarke actually was. She didn't know yet. But Dr. Pierce would know in less than 12 hours. The background check triggered at 6:22 a.m. 2 men in dark suits walked through St. Michael's main entrance like they owned the air around them. Federal badges clipped to their belts. Nobody said anything, but the ER staff felt the pressure change. They didn't ask for Hannah Clarke by name. They didn't have to. The hospital's compliance officer walked them straight to administration, and within 90 seconds, they had Dr. Pierce's entire file spread across a conference table. The suits, one tall and expressionless, one with the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years behind a military desk, began making phone calls. Quiet calls. The kind that end careers. By 8:44 a.m., the veteran was awake in ICU, extubated now, breathing on his own. The morphine haze had lifted enough that his eyes focused. He was tracking the ceiling tiles, counting them the way soldiers count things when they're trying to anchor themselves back to the world. A nurse came in to check his lines. Standard rounds. Vital signs stable. O2 sat 96%. Healing breath by breath. He didn't say anything until Hannah appeared in the doorway, chart in hand, checking his post-procedure notes like she'd done it 100 times before. The moment his eyes found her, everything stopped. His hand moved to his forearm. The tattoo. The faded ink that said H. Clarke, Bagram, 2019. His voice came out like gravel from a dry well. Valkyrie 6. Just those 2 words. Just enough to shatter the last 4 walls between them. Hannah didn't move. She didn't react. She closed the chart. She set it on the bedside table with the precision of someone placing evidence. She looked at him for 3 seconds, not more, not less, and then she nodded. Once. Acknowledgement. I see you. I remember. I'm here. The veteran's eyes filled with something that wasn't pain for the first time since he'd arrived at this hospital breathing like a drowning man. She turned to leave. She had to. The suits were waiting. A Marine officer in dress blues was pulling her service record from the secure federal database when she reached the administrative corridor. A captain, same rank as hers, different branch, was reading the summary aloud to the hospital's chief of staff. His voice carried the weight of someone reciting scripture. Captain Hannah Clarke, he said. Bronze Star with Valor. The words hung in the air. Purple Heart. He looked up from the page. He'd expected to see surprise on the faces around the table. He saw something else entirely. Recognition. The hospital's legal team already understood. This wasn't an unauthorized procedure by a rogue nurse. This was a classified military operation. And they'd been trying to fire her for it. The phone in the chief of staff's hands buzzed. An email notification. The hospital's internal investigation into Pierce's conduct had moved faster than anyone expected. The compliance team had pulled his case files from the past 18 months. 12 veterans. That number again. 12 men and women with legitimate emergencies, every single one turned away with the same diagnosis, medication seeking, non-compliant, not worth the legal liability. All of them redirected to county hospital across town. Pierce kept his surgical schedule clear for elective procedures. High-margin procedures. He'd been billing consultation fees for patients he never examined, coding them as completed evaluations, padding his surgical numbers to hit the compensation tier that came with a $200,000 annual bonus. Insurance fraud moving like cancer through the system. The suits exchanged a look. They'd seen worse, but not much worse. Not in a place that was supposed to heal people. By 2:36 p.m., the state medical board had issued an emergency suspension. By 4:11 p.m., they'd opened a criminal investigation coordinated with federal prosecutors. The licensing investigator Pierce had called in as a personal favor received a subpoena by email requesting all communications with Dr. Pierce over the past 3 years. Every text. Every call. Every favor owed and collected. Security escorted Pierce from the premises at 5:15 p.m. with his personal effects in a cardboard box the size of his collapsed credibility. His expensive Italian shoes clicked against the tile one last time. The ER staff watched from behind the nursing station. Nobody said anything. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of institutional justice moving like a glacier, slow, inevitable, and crushing everything in its path. 6 months later, Hannah drove a state vehicle past a rural clinic 40 miles outside Raleigh, the kind of place that served 3 counties and had a perpetually understaffed pharmacy. A man was unloading boxes from the back of a medical supply van. Wearing work boots now instead of Italian leather. Hands doing the grunt work he'd always believed himself above. Dr. Pierce didn't look up. He didn't recognize the car. His medical license was permanently revoked. His criminal trial was scheduled for September. His network had scattered like rats from a sinking ship. The board members who'd owed him favors now stayed silent when his name came up. The physicians who'd followed his lead on patient refusals had started documenting things differently. The entire culture of the place had shifted because one captain had refused to let a dying man die alone. Hannah didn't stop the vehicle. She didn't need to. She reached into her jacket lining and felt the faded unit patch she'd kept sewn there since Bagram, the same insignia the veteran had touched when he finally recognized her in that supply closet. The same patch worn by 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines during the worst year of both their lives. She could feel the frayed edges of it, the weight of it pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The veteran had healed. 3 weeks in ICU, then transferred to the VA hospital in Durham where they didn't measure worth by insurance codes and surgical productivity. He was walking with a cane now, but he was walking. 2 months after discharge, he'd attended her commendation ceremony at Fort Bragg, where a 2-star general had pinned a 2nd Bronze Star to her uniform. The general had asked her why she'd blown her cover for one patient, why she'd risked 8 months of intelligence work, why she'd chosen a dying stranger over a classified operation. Hannah had reached for the patch sewn into her jacket and said it quietly, with the kind of certainty that comes from having already survived the worst. Because some missions matter more than others. The general had nodded. He understood. Most people didn't. She'd returned to St. Michael's 3 weeks later. This time without pretense. Without cover. The board had voted unanimously to make her Director of Emergency Services. They wanted someone who understood protocol. Someone who understood when to break it. The first policy she implemented was mandatory treatment for all veterans, regardless of perceived compliance history. She'd standardized intake procedures so patients couldn't be turned away based on physician preference. She'd created an oversight committee. She'd eliminated the bonus structure that incentivized denying care. On her first day in the office, she'd framed the scrubs she'd folded in the laundry that night, the night she'd been fired for saving a life. Below them, a small plaque, sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. It wasn't a philosophy. It was a promise. 12 doctors had refused one patient. She'd spend the next decade making sure it never happened again. The patch stayed sewn in her jacket. The weight of it stayed constant. A reminder that some disguises don't define you. Sometimes they reveal you. And sometimes the person who carries your name on their skin is the one who finally knows who you are. If this story resonated with you, share it. Send it to someone in healthcare, someone in military service, someone who's been underestimated and undervalued. Subscribe to this channel because these stories matter. Like this video and comment below. Have you ever been judged only to find out the person doubting you had no idea who they were standing next to? What would you have done in Hannah's position?